In this lesson, we're going to talk about deploying our application live to production using a managed service like Vercel or self-hosting our application to a Node.js service that we're running on a third-party platform like Railway. We're going to also talk about static exports, which allows you to turn your Next.js application into static files like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, and then deploy them or host them on any static service provider. Now, when using a platform like Vercel, which requires zero config to deploy your Next.js app, it's actually running your build process behind the scene and then serving it up using the Next.js production server. Now, to understand what happens there, we can run the build script or use the build API on our local machine to get familiar with the output of that process so that we can understand what happens if we are actually self-hosting our Next.js application on a service that runs a Node.js server. So just come to our application over here. I'm going to stop the development server and I'm going to run pm run build. As you can see, this build script started creating an optimized production build of our application. It created some routes and different pages based on what we had here. And if we look at our code base, this .next folder was added to our code base, which is all the files and folders that has been generated as part of this build process. Now you have the next cache up top. This is your cache for data fetching results or pages or images. The server contains any part of your application that actually requires a server. Now the static folder contains anything that could be turned into static files. The chunks relates to the pages of your application. The CSS, the media is for any images that you've used and statically imported it into your files using the next image and so on. So as you can see, this is the folder that is going to be later on served up using a production server. And to run the production server, we've already touched on it in the first lesson, but you would run pm start, which is different from your development server. This is actually going to serve up that next folder or the build output. Now, as I mentioned, when you want to deploy to Vercel, you don't have to run this build script and starting your next production server manually. This is taken care of behind the scene. Actually, when you are deploying to Vercel, it automatically detects that you're using Next.js and does all of this behind the scene. Now, on top of that, Vercel actually does more for your Next.js app. Your pages will be statically optimized. Your assets like your JavaScript, CSS, images, fonts are going to be served up from a global CDN network or the edge network as they call it. Your API routes are going to be turned or served up as isolated serverless functions, and your middlewares are going to be deployed as edge functions. Now, edge functions are functions that run on the edge runtime, which is a runtime similar to Node.js, but it's limited in terms of the APIs you can use. But the benefit is that it has almost close to zero cold start, which boots instantly, and it's way faster if you're running a function that runs before the response is sent back to your client. Middlewares intercept the request, and then you can just rewrite and redirect and change the response that you want to send into your clients. We're going to talk about middleware in a future lesson, but for now, just know that our middlewares are going to be deployed automatically as edge functions. Now, Vercel as a platform also provides more stuff that makes your life as a developer easier. So automatic SSL certificates, custom domains, image optimization with next image, automatic CI/CD development processes through GitHub. So you push your code to GitHub, it automatically picks up your commits and push them to production. Now let's actually see this in action. So first, let's commit our code. So I'm going to create our first initial commit of our application. Let me just make this a bit smaller over here. So git commit, let's just call this our initial commit. And now I want to push this to our remote GitHub repository. So I'm just going to go to my GitHub account. I'm going to create a new GitHub repository. I'm going to call this next starter kit maybe. So I'm going to create this repository as a public repository. You can also access this This is the same project we created in the first lesson, which is configured to work with Tailwind. We got rid of the clutter and added the Tailwind plugin to make it a blank slate for every time we wanted to create a Next.js 13 app. Now we're going to add this as an origin to our app. We're going to create the main branch, and we're actually going to push our code to here. So if we refresh the page over here, we should be able to see our Next.js app. Now the next step is to actually go to our Vercel dashboard. From here, I'm going to create a new project. And I've already configured Vercel to be connected to my GitHub account. If you haven't, you can just go ahead and do it. From my GitHub account, it just picks up the projects that I have. The next starter kit is the one that we just created. So I'm going to select that. It automatically picks up the Next.js as my framework. If I have any environment variables, we can add them here. At this point, we don't have anything, but if we had, we could just do this. We hit deploy, which is going to run the build script behind the scene, and then start a production server that actually serves up that production build or the output of the build process. Now, as you can see, our project was deployed and it's now live. I can continue to go to the dashboard, and from here, we can actually visit the live URL that points to our Next.js app up top over there. With that out of the way, let's just go back to the docs and actually talk about self-hosting our application. Now, when it comes to self-hosting your Next.js app, you have three main options. First is to deploy your app to any service that runs a Node.js server. The second option is to run it on a service that supports Docker. So you can use a Docker image and a Docker container to deploy your app. And the third option is a static export, which turns your Next.js application into static files, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and you can deploy it to a service that just allows you to host static files. Now let's talk about the Node.js server. All you need to do on any platform that you're running is really to run this build script that we actually saw together, and then start your production server by running npm run start. As a side note, if you wanted to use Next.image and benefit from Next.image optimization, it is recommended to also install Sharp, which is an npm package that helps with the image optimization together with your Next.image. You can run npm install Sharp in your project directory to actually use this package. Now, the next option is Docker image. As I mentioned, you can deploy your Next.js app to any platform that supports Docker. You can just create your Docker container with this example. You can clone this with Docker example from the Next.js repository. You can create and build your container and then run it on that service. Now, the last option, as I mentioned, is a static HTML export. This is going to run the build process with a flag that you're going to pass to your Next.js config. It's going to turn your project or your application into static files. And obviously, with this option comes some limitations. Anything that requires a server wouldn't work with the static export. Things like rewrites and redirects and headers inside your Next config, middleware or incremental static regeneration won't work with the static export because it's just literally files that you're hosting on a CDN. There is no server actually running, but it's totally compatible with React Server components. And all that happens is that all of your code is going to run at the build process. Your React Server components are going to be rendered on the server when you're running the build process. Any data fetching that is required for your components is going to be run on the server, and it's going to output an out directory, which is literally called out. And then you can serve up the content of that out directory to any static site server. Now, as a side note for using static exports, you don't have to run the next export script that we used to do in Next.js 12. That has been deprecated. And actually, all you need to do is to pass in this out export to your next config.js, and you would just run the regular next build script. This is going to look at your config, and based on this, it's going to create a static export of your application. You can also optionally change the directory name. So the dist directory defaults to out. If you want to change it to something like dist or build or whatever you want, you can also change that. And that's all you need to do. After running the next build, Next.js is going to produce an out folder which contains your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript assets, which you can then deploy to any service or server that allows you to serve static assets. That's a wrap for this lesson, folks. We talked about deploying our Next.js app to Vercel. We also talked about self-hosting our application on a Node.js server or a Docker container. We also talked about statically exporting our Next.js application, which literally turns our application into a bunch of static files that you can serve up on any static host. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about routing, which is the heart of our Next.js app. With the use of the app router, it allows us to create different layouts, nested layouts, routes, and pages in our application and more. See you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.